I don't believe in like I think journalism is inherently subjective, and that uh, you're never going to get to an objective like state of play.
Welcome to Beyond the Beat, a podcast by Chain Story, the agency to elevate your status in crypto. I'm your host, Pedro, and every week I'll be talking to the people in crypto media. We'll be telling their stories, their failures, their lessons, and whatever tips or tricks they've got up their sleeves.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Beat. Super excited to chat to Ben Weiss, Dubai correspondent for DL News, and Bylines, Fortune, Gizmodo, The Verge, and a bunch of other stuff that we're going to chat about today. Ben, thanks heaps for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
So look, why don't I know who you are? And I'm sure that there's a bunch of people who are listening in who also know who you are. But then there's probably some people who don't know who you are or who have run across your byline somewhere in DL News or across another publication. But yeah, could you tell us a little bit about how you got into crypto journalism and why you're still here?
Yeah, so I think I'm thinking of where to start. So basically, like, I went to grad school for journalism. So I did this 2-year program that was like a dual degree in journalism and international relations. And so I've always kind of been interested in writing about tech because I took like 5 computer science classes in college. So I have like a background in coding, and, journalism is horribly competitive. So it's often good to think about your comparative advantage. So I was thinking about tech stories. And, when in this grad program, like this graduate school program, I had the luxury of, planning out like longer stories and getting funding to do some stories. So I was interested in like tech's intersection with migration because that was like kind of my dual degree, both journalism and international relations. And so, the kind of the first story that I feel like kind of skirted around crypto was I did this feature for Slate about basically this like underground gold economy for RuneScape. It's just like, I don't know if you've heard of RuneScape before.
Yeah, I have.
Yeah.
And there was also like this is like slightly off like tangential, but there's like this really funny like video meme that had like RuneScape, that it was ambianced in RuneScape with the song, but it was actually like this guy texting his girlfriend and getting the photo of his girlfriend wrong. And so it went like through this like RuneScape mission, but it was actually like back and forth texting with his girlfriend. It was hilarious.
I haven't seen that, but do send it over.
I will.
It sounds as bizarre as RuneScape as it usually is. But yeah, so basically it's this like extremely old video game. And then, there were some stories, but no one had done like a feature about, there is this large community in Venezuela of people who play RuneScape to like earn much more than the monthly wage than they would get, especially in like the super hyper inflationary times in Venezuela and like the kind of like flagging economy there. So I talked to this one guy and then talked to a few other people who had actually made enough money through RuneScape to finance migration journeys.
How much money would that have to be? Did he tell you?
So the guy, my main character of the piece, I think it was his name, Alexander. He was making around $60, $70 a month. But he was like planning on, moving, but he hadn't, gotten there yet. But I had spoken to a few other people, like this one guy, he and his sister, they sat down for a year and all they did was just play RuneScape. And I think they were eventually like able to save up like $500, $600 to finance a journey from like Venezuela to take a bus that like went on the circuitous ride up to like Colombia and then into Peru. And now the guy works as like a doorman in Peru.
Interesting.
So I think it was like, I forget the exact. I'd have to look. You have to fact check me. You have to look back at the exact numbers. But it's like, the monthly wage at that time. This was 2022 when I was writing in Venezuela, was like in the dollars. Like it wasn't even like 10 or 20. This amount of money that people were making was super like past that. So anyway, I did this first story, and then I was thinking of other stories where it's like oftentimes when you're thinking about like internationalized tech, you're thinking about money, and I started reporting and talking to these Christian turned Bitcoin missionaries, essentially these people who had like spread the gospel of God, and Christianity, like in India and elsewhere, but then we're using the same proselytizing techniques to spread the gospel of Bitcoin in Guatemala and El Salvador. So I got some funding to go down to Guatemala, and I like tagged around for a week with this guy and did a profile of him for Gizmodo.
Were you already into Bitcoin at that point, or did they manage to preach you into crypto?
No, I mean, as opposed to, I don't actually know what the like percentage split of journalists in crypto are in terms of like whether they're, big believers in it or not. No, they didn't. And I'm still like, pretty skeptical of it. I just like, and maybe this gets to your question of like why I still do report on crypto. It's just like, I don't do it from like an ideological sense. Like I'm trying to spread the gospel of crypto, or I think it's going to, change the world. I do it because there's so many weird people in crypto. The stories you can write are great. And it's a fun beat to report on because, you're not talking to like, sometimes you talk to straight-laced bankers, right? Like that are, you talk to somebody from Franklin Templeton and they don't tell you anything. Or you talk to somebody from like Goldman Sachs, or like you have to go through like 13 different like PR people to try to talk to somebody from Goldman Sachs. But then you can just like talk to this random person who's like just shouts something to you at a conference about like money is God or something. I don't know. You just nothing that I can say that's like weird about crypto will ever be like something that's untrue. Like it has happened.
Yeah, no, I think it's like the kind of place where anything goes, and everything is like, accepting of it going as well.
What does that mean?
So it's an industry where the weirdness is super embraced, and it's just like it runs core to the sort of how people interact with each other, how like I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who's not in crypto at all, and I was telling him about like laser eyes, and this was like super like small detail. But he's like, so what do you mean? Like everybody on Twitter, everybody everywhere has like laser eyes, and you talk to each other like, oh, there's a group of people that's like the laser eyes. What? I don't even understand where to start on the questions that I have for why this is a thing, but it's a thing, and it's like a big thing as well.
Yeah, it is like I think I look at crypto through like an anthropological lens, where it's just like this is a community of like weirdos, and they're making like interesting political statements about like what kind of like society should look like. That are intellectually stimulating. Like these questions are not just like facile and stupid. So like I think it's like an intellectually stimulating beat to report on, and then also you can just write good stories. Like I don't know, like my colleague Liam just did a story today about Gavin Wood, one of the co-founders of Ethereum, and how he's like now into DJing and he has like his DJ name is DJ Wasabi. Like what?
DJ Wasabi.
Yeah, DJ Wasabi. Like what is that? Like it's so weird. I don't know. And it was just like you just meet. I met this guy at this like just crypto drinks thing a couple of weeks or maybe a month or two ago, and he was just like, "Oh yeah, I rug people," and I was just like, "What do you?"
Just nonchalantly.
Yeah, and I was just like. He was like, "Oh, like, do you promote like meme coins or tokens through your journalism?" And I'm like, "No, because like, when you're writing from a platform, you do have the potential to move markets and change markets, and it would be unethical to to like change markets in a way that was manipulative or completely falsified. He was like, damn. Damn.
He's like, he must have been inside his head being like, that's exactly what I'm looking for.
No,
like,
no, he's like, damn, I guess you don't like what I do. I was like, all power to you. Like, yeah, I mean, like, not all power, like, don't do that. But I'm like, okay, like, just brace him.
Why do you think crypto has that sort of allure to these sort of bizarre people? I was talking to a cousin of mine not long ago, and we focus like about scammers mostly, and he's like, you guys have condensed like the scammers of every other industry. You've attracted them all to yours, and that's why there's a bunch of people that don't like them, and that's one of the reasons why he's like strongly against them. But why do you think that like we have such this tendency to attract this like subset or a set of bizarre people in society?
I mean, I guess it's like, well, because there's like two questions there, right? It's like the weird question, and then there's the scammer question, right? And I think the weird question is, I mean, I think like crypto is a subset of just like online tech culture. And like people that are kind of like terminally online are often like terminally maladjusted. So, like they're like socially
terminally
like,
unhinged.
terminally like a little bit like socially not maybe not totally the cool kids at high school, one could say. So yeah, I think there's like that's part of it. Why else is crypto weird? I mean, it's also the history of it too. Like it came from this like cypherpunk movement of just like complete, anonymous individuals, like the kind of, if we're sticking with the religion analogy that I was talking about earlier, like Satoshi Nakamoto is like, the prophet, right? Like, but we don't know who he is. Like, it's just like a weird, like the origin story for all of this is also quite weird. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, every industry always has its weirdos. I do think in crypto, it's also the anonymity aspect of it too. Where there's this kind of like embrace of at least pseudo anonymity, which I think lets people, both maybe in good and bad, like is the problem with anonymity more generally, is both say bonkers things and then also maybe be more comfortable just being out there, rather than having to like feel like they have to fit into a suit or tie or something like that.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I appreciate the anonymity side of things, and I think it's fun to be working in an area or in an industry where that's allowed, and that's
really
not. Well, I mean, why not? Why do we have to live in this like fully transparent, tell exactly who you are, why can't people just like live under some sort of veil of something in front of them? I mean, as long as they're not doing harm or like, doing some of the disastrous stuff that they do. I don't really have a trouble with people wanting to be anonymous, especially in this day and age. Like, if you can get away with being anonymous, like that's also a feat in and of itself.
I don't know. My feeling. Well, this question of anonymity, I think, is like always an inherent irony of crypto, where it's like a decentralized blockchain, like purely transparent. You can see where all the transactions are going, but then there's this just, I think, inherent tension, I think, in crypto between anonymity and transparency, more generally, of like, what is considered transparent and what's considered anonymous. I mean, I personally like. I guess I get the point, but then on the other side of things, like, why not just? I mean, it would be one thing if I think it's a complicated question because it's also like you talk about people's like given names and how maybe that they don't want to be called by that anymore, right? And it's like we're foisting this system of like birth names or legal names onto people who don't want those names to refer to themselves as much anymore. But then also on the other side of things, like, if you're always able to hide, like making new identities is extremely easy, and like the current online culture we have. So you can spin up a new identity if you're a scammer, right? Like, oh crap, like people know my handle is like, Ben Weiss scammer. Okay, now I'm going to make it like Ben Weiss is not a scammer, and then like,
and surely that nod is going to sway people. Yeah.
But my point is that there's been like there are examples of people who like who have like kind of cycled through usernames and like, but are still the same person. So it's kind of like it's not like there's a one-to-one correspondence between someone's like pseudonym and like their actual identity. People can kind of cycle through them.
I do think, going back to your previous point though, I do think that we have to divorce like the idea that because the technology is fully transparent, then the people who operate in the industry also have to be fully transparent. I don't see that those are necessarily like exclusive or that they have to be aligned. And then I agree with the idea that like scammers can completely make use of the sort of quote unquote acceptance that we have of anonymity. But then at the same time, there's a bunch of people that are anonymous and then like to say, like Satoshi wanted to be anonymous, stayed anonymous. Who knows what would happen if he came out and got ousted today is who they, he, her, whoever they are. But like beyond the scammer culture, if a regular person that has interesting thoughts, interesting ideas, like somebody that comes to mind, for example, is, and I don't know if they've been doxxed or not, but like Punk6529, I think is his handle on Twitter, who's like writes these massive threads, does these really interesting analysis, and might be saying stuff that he wouldn't be comfortable saying if they were saying their actual name or anything like that. So that gives you some degree of like comfort to be able to say something. Or like even Zach XBT, like the sort of sleuthing that he does and the stuff that he uncovers. Who knows if that would be able to happen if his real name was out there and people knew his identity.
Well, he's been doxxed.
He has been doxxed, and that was actually a conversation. Yeah. But
so I mean, but maybe it's a good example. He's been doxxed, and like, what's happened to him? Like I don't. Maybe Zach XBT will slide into my DMs and say like, this has been the XYZ consequences of my getting doxxed, but. I mean, I guess I'll like go back to it, and we don't have to spend the entire conversation on it. But like, how do you reconcile ideologically the idea of like a completely transparent, decentralized database / like computational system with a non-transparent operators of those systems? Like, because I think they're in one aspect we're valorizing transparency, and in the other aspect we're not.
I mean, I don't think we're not valorizing transparency by allowing anonymity. And I think that the people that are anonymous are a very small segment of it. I'm just saying that the fact that it exists is appreciated. But yeah.
I mean, I think it's an interesting question, and it's just like something inherent. I think kind of that people, it's a critique or observation that people like make about crypto often, and I think it's a valid one. But you could also think it's not valid, and we can agree to that.
And we'd be totally fine.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, going back to let's go back into crypto media or journalism and that sort of stuff. You're working at DL News at the moment. DL News is like well known. I'm a big fan, by the way, of the stuff that you guys put out. But you're very sort of, I'm not going to say necessarily like day after news, but there's not necessarily like breaking or speed or anything like that. But you're looking for that extra analysis. How do you like? I suppose you working there, you're a fan of it, but how important do you think is this sort of tension or this sort of idea of speed versus maybe something that's been a little bit more fleshed out and something that's been a little bit more analyzed when something breaking happens or when stories get published?
I mean, I think it's a correct approximation of DL News. Like we generally don't cover breaking news unless it's big. Like I think somebody's writing up the CFTC settlement with Uniswap Labs. Like that's big enough news where we should cover that. Or when Consensus was sued by the SEC, I wrote that up because that's big. But we're generally not doing like more minute updates about Mt. Gox transfers or I'm trying to think of like things that are, more like kind of incremental. But or we don't do a lot of it, and we don't do really aggregation of other competitors' news unless like we're able to do a slightly new update on it, which is something that I think like CoinDesk on the block, for example, they kind of dominate in that. I mean, they're very good at it. They're very good at kind of like spinning up things quickly. I mean, I think part of it is just like staff, right? We just don't have the staff to compete with these outlets, just in terms of numbers, right? So like we have to like, what's the added value that we can provide, right? Because I mean, for me too, it's like, I don't necessarily believe that journalism, especially in this like new media environment, right, where people can get their news through Twitter, X, through different social media feeds, and they can often get it sometimes directly from the source. Like let's say like with the OpenSea Wells Notice news, like Devin Finzer, announced that himself. So they don't need to go through me to get it. But so then the question is like, what's the added value then of a journalist and of a writer? And one I think like pretty clear way of doing it is through analysis, right? Like through analysis and through like doing a day two take. That's like, okay, well, like here are the implications of X, Y, Z.
Yeah, no, I like day two takes, and that's probably what I read most, like in my free time, or the stuff that I'm always looking for. And in that sense, how important do you think it is for a journalist to sort of give their own take to a story? Because a lot of the times you want to be just straight reporting, tell the facts, maybe add in a few vantage points from, hopefully two different or the three sources. But then I sometimes like when journalists add in their own take. It doesn't have to be like a straight, just like, hey, this is what I think, but they're just like nudging it along in some direction. Do you agree? Or do you think that the journalist should always stay far removed from what their viewpoint is of a story?
Well, I mean, and this gets into kind of like a central tension, I think, throughout media and journalism. You're talking to someone who like studied history in college and like is coming from like a social sciences and like more like literature background. So, but I don't believe in objectivity. Like, I think that, there's a well-known professor at NYU. I forgot his like name, but he talks about journalism as being quote like a voice from nowhere, where it's like by pretending to be objective, you're not grounding readers in any sort of like concrete way of or lens of understanding something. And yeah, so generally, I don't believe in objectivity, and I think that's something that you're seeing more and more news outlets like try to cop to or try to be honest to readers about. Like for example, Semaphore and Axios, they both have like often dedicated blocks in their articles where that's like, here's my take, here's what I think, right? And oftentimes us as journalists, like we have an analysis, right? But we kind of have to go through these complicated jujitsu like contortions to like we ask an expert who we think probably shares the same analysis, right? And then the expert then says the analysis, and then we can say expert says the analysis rather than us, having said it, right? And I think there's sometimes a more honesty and just being straight about what your take is. But so I guess my answer to your question is I don't believe in like I think journalism is inherently subjective, and that you're never going to get to an objective like state of play when you're
so
reading
why do you think media companies or editors don't strive for just accepting that reality and just like continue on with this sort of veil of we're unbiased, neutral, and not going to try to sway you or even tell you what you think, when it's a lot easier and it would be a lot more transparent to toss that out there, to just say it, like this is sort of what we believe and this is the way that we're going to portray the story.
Yeah, I mean, like I do think there's something different between being like completely objective but also being fair, right, and being accurate. Like I think those shouldn't be necessarily counterposed, or like, being accurate and fair I think is still possible to be done without claiming that you're showing the true light of the situation, because being fair is reaching out to all parties named in a story, right, to see what they can say. Being accurate is making sure that there are enough facts that you're saying that are they're either verifiable or able to be corroborated, that are not misconstrued or misstated. I mean, the question of media history and journalism we can talk about. Like that's an entire course, right?
Yeah.
But from and please do fact check me here and make sure that I'm not misstating things. But like the idea of objectivity in journalism is like a relatively recent invention. Like it's only something from like the late 19th century / early 20th century in American media. Like before that, there was the idea of yellow journalism, which was like extremely party based, pretty baldly pro archon, like a political position, for example. And I think in late 19th century, early 20th century, like that began to change. I think partly from, and this is why I'm just like, this is me just saying stuff, and you should fact check me. But
I will after this.
Yeah, please do. But yeah, I think it was partly because there was this kind of like movement in social sciences and just like more generally of the idea that of bringing like kind of a scientific lens to like humanities and humanistic focused studies. So that was like partly put onto it. And I think it was also like a revenue thing too for media companies. Like in the early 20th century, there was, I think some people have written that if you don't take a stand as much, or if you seem to be more neutral, there will be more advertisers who are willing to like, advertise on a platform. So it's partly an economic, like, I don't think it was like purely like an ethical / like ideological push to kind of front load objectivity in journalism. I think there was also like an economics incentive to it as well.
Do you think that we're moving towards any sort of future? Because the media landscape, like you said before, is changing, and it's changing pretty rapidly. Do you think that we are moving towards like a sort of post-objective journalism world? Or is there going to be like an even more, a larger carving of this sort of, this is the kind of journalism that we need? Because nowadays you've got like citizen journalists, you've got independent journalists, you've got content creators that think they're journalists. They could be journalists. I'm not saying that they're not, but... and people are like giving their opinions 100%, trying to sway people one way or the other. And so do you think that we're moving in any particular direction, or just like shooting at whatever we can, trying to figure out what's going to be, what people are going to be reading, or what readers are going to be like aiming for?
I don't know. I mean, like,
I appreciate a good I don't know.
I'm no fortune teller. I do think that we're seeing journalism become more partisan. And I think that's, I mean, like the factors behind that are probably manifold, and like, right, like there's the weird kind of bubbles that we create on social media, where people are only posting the articles, from the publications that they like, right, that contribute to this. Then there's also some probably, I wonder, like it would be interesting, like for Fox News, for example, like, if there's a way to like categorize or measure if they've gone more like rightward leaning over the past 10 to 20 years as a way of trying to capture like a specific audience. Like I know that they've like been more pro-Trump like once he like started being president. So there's obviously moves from news organizations to try to capture like specific groups. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, ideally, I'd love a world where we would like, where it would be, I think also part of this is media literacy too. right? Like it should be taught in schools, or it should be like people, first of all, shouldn't just look at headlines. Second of all, people shouldn't, there should be like more of an emphasis in schools about like how to like just like told kind of point blank to everybody that like every publication and every writer and always will have a bias, no matter how obvious or how implicit it's going to be. And it's your task as a reader to kind of like figure that out and then, evaluate whether they're being fair or inaccurate. All while like, holding in your head that like, yeah, every person is a person and our brains are not giant computers,
Yeah. I actually think that's, and yeah, I don't know what the numbers are or anything like that, but I'd be hard pressed to see that that's not the case and that it's getting even worse. Like I was just thinking, like a couple weeks ago, or maybe it was last week or something, that whole Washington Reporter story coming out with Kamala Harris saying that she was going to like put Gary Gensler as Treasury Secretary, and there were people in our media, like big publications, who decided to run with the story. And then it's like, even within our industry, like professionals who don't have media literacy, or I mean, sometimes you can make mistakes and like you can just overlook stuff. I'm not saying that they don't have it, but that conversation sparked with a few friends, what would media literacy look like? Especially because you see people that even today, nowadays, nobody reads. Like reading comprehension is at an all-time low. The amount that like the way people consume all sorts of information, there's a sort of, the news has become just like a grab for that. Maybe it's always been like this, but just like grab for the headlines, get as superficial as you can, and then on to the next. And I think that social media obviously has a role to play in that, but then I do think that schools also have a role to play in that, where they just haven't put enough emphasis on how to properly vet sources, or what is a source, what isn't a source. And they just end up like third partying it to it, which is fine to a degree, to media outlets and journalists and editors and other parties in the landscape, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, there are some facts, right, in what you said to fact check, right? I don't know. Is reading comprehension at an all-time low? Like, how do we measure that?
Well, I know that when I was in university years ago, I'm not going to say how many years, but not years ago, and there were multiple studies that I remember we were looking at, that at least in Chile, I went to university in Chile, reading comprehension.
What was what's the like premier Chilean university?
Universidad Católica.
Yes. Did you go there?
I didn't go there. No,
you didn't
unfortunately.
Go there. Oh,
no.
Come on, Pedro.
No, because otherwise I would have said that one, and then I would have gotten fact check and fallen for that gig, and that would have been just like that. Then I would have been shot.
But you remember in class that you were...
I was remembering university, and we were passing it, and I remember this was like 2010 or 2011, and there were multiple studies that were showing that people were reading less than ever, and people were understanding what they were reading at less than ever. And I can't imagine that trend having been reversed in the past 10, 12 years. I mean, hopefully I'm wrong, but I just can't imagine it having gotten better.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'd have to look at the data, there are also like how one measures that. It's also probably like country specific and age, whatever, specific as well. But I don't know. What was your question? Was it just about like reading comprehension, or like?
I think it was along the lines of like media literacy. I don't think there was a question inside that rant. There was just like a rant that I think grasped at a couple questions.
Or maybe it was like a little bit. I feel like the vibe I got was like doom vibes, where it's like.
No, I had a doomsday sort of vibe for a couple years back, but I'm not a doomsday vibe kind of person. Yeah, I'm an insufferable optimist. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think like to maybe jump off of it. And getting to the point of like what is journalism, or like what's the point of, like let's assume that reading comprehensions are going lower, and that there's always social media, which I think this is like pretty indisputable, like social media has really changed the way people consume news. What gives me optimism, and what makes me, not at least bail ship right now, is that like, if you do a thought experiment and you say, if you race to the bottom, if we're just reading headlines, right, and if we're not reading, like, what's going to happen? Like, we're just it's going to be just people yelling at each other about a sentence that no one's read anything about. Like, I think there's always going to be a place for in-depth reporting and original reporting and original analysis. Like, and maybe the group of people who read it will get less, or maybe it has to be repackaged in ways to appeal to a broader demographic. But I just can't imagine a world where we're either just repackaging press releases or just repackaging like statements from government officials, right? Then that world saddens me. So kind of jumping off of that, like the thing that I think gives me hope is like, okay, well, I don't want that world, and I don't think a lot of people want that world either. So there is always going to be a place for like an independent voice and an independent kind of, I don't know, take on what's going on.
I mean, I agree, and it's something that I think about a lot, and it's something that I think that we need a lot more, like independent journalists and some, not just independent media, but just like independent journalists and people that are actually doing a lot of the stuff that's not even getting reported by us. But yeah, I do think it'll be interesting to see over the next 5 years, like how people consume their information, what sort of media or what sort of information they want. Like, I'm mostly of the written word. And despite this is a new medium, but I'm intrigued by how also I'm going to have to write differently moving forward. And how that's also going to have to get repackaged, and what the language is going to have to be like moving forward. And I think there's always going to be a space for like lengthy the New Yorker or the Verge style research pieces and that sort of stuff. But there's a part of me that also thinks there's going to be a lot more like short bites onto the next. And I mean, finding out where your place is or what actually interests you, or what serves best is going to be an interesting tug of war, I think, moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I like totally agree that everyone's just trying to experiment and see what works. Like, just because articles are written the way they were, 50, 60 years ago, that doesn't necessarily mean they have to be written the same way now. I mean, but there is also like, I think, there's like kind of the productized version or idea of journalism where it's just like, this is purely a utility. But then there's also like the aesthetic point too, right? Where it's like, there's something beautiful about like an extremely well-written and like long form narrative nonfiction piece, right? And like, okay, maybe not a lot of people read it, but also not a lot of people really understand like, I don't know, the complexities of like a Matisse painting, and MoMA. But it still is beautiful. So, I mean, there's also like an aesthetic point of view too, where there is something like if you like a really well-written news article or, piece of nonfiction is I think has value inherent in and of itself.
So if somebody were to say to you, journalism, I know that there's the typical cliche that journalism or the media is always 5 years away from death. But if there's somebody that comes up to you and is like, nah, journalism doesn't matter anymore, or it's all just, it's all pushing people in one direction. Like, how would you respond? Why does journalism matter?
Why does journalism matter? I mean, I think it goes back to the idea that, do we want, and maybe this is kind of my like scenario that I was talking about earlier, where it's like, do we want a future where people are not allowed to kind of, where all information we're consuming is either coming from extremely powerful figures, right? Like I think a lot of people in the tech industry say like, oh, it's tech versus the media, right? And the media is going to bring us down. But like, let's be real, Silicon Valley has hundreds of millions, trillions of dollars. like, I'm sorry, like anyone in the media, we all know what media salaries are. We are nothing compared to VCs or like Mark Zuckerberg or anything like that. So, do we want information and analysis of information to purely be done through the perspective of those with a lot of money and those with a lot of power? That's more like from the government side. And I don't really know if we want that, right? Like, I don't think we want people analyzing and interpreting and distributing information to be only from certain siloed groups of powerful people. So, so I think that then therefore, like, how is an independent voice going to like provide analysis and to how is an independent voice going to provide analysis and like package that to people, et cetera, like that's like a utility or like that's a practical question, right? But I do think like I think it would be hard to I don't know if I would agree with an argument that says no, we don't need that independent pipeline.
No, and I think that in today's age, like when like institutional trust is at all-time low, people realize that Zuckerberg and like all these people are just fucking around with us or doing whatever they want, really. I think that there is going to be that push for, or that need, or that desire for the more independent news, for the smaller outlets. And it'll be interesting to see, because I think that we're also at the behest of like algorithms and distribution channels and how you can, and like financing and how you can get in front of people's eyes or inside people's minds when it's not that easy when you're just starting out or when you have a small following, even if you have like some pretty incredible scoops or some pretty incredible investigations and sources and all that sort of stuff. So it's going to be, there's definitely going to be a space, but I'm unsure how it's going to get carved out.
And I mean, it might be. I mean, there's different models that people are working like. There are different models that people are working with, like the nonprofit model. That's something that like has its own criticisms and own difficulties, but like we've seen with like local news, maybe just in the U.S., right? It's been completely hollowed out, but there is something super, I think, necessary about like having somebody attend those community meetings where they can see that somebody's just saying something crazy and then they can call that person out. Like there's I lived in New York for like 6 or 7 years, and there's this great nonprofit news outlet called The City, and they just went to this community board meeting, and they would just go to community board meetings, and then they found out that like one of the like lower city officials just like spent like $30K or something around there, like on like a minivan that they just drove around all the way. And it's just like, and then like, they wrote it, and then the person was like reprimanded. Like there was something like, if we don't have independent voices, then I don't think stories like that will get written. So,
no. And I also think that also points to like two things that we might be facing in the future, which is like idea of like journalists going local and like like there might be some sort of, there's definitely going to be a space for like local journalism and like people like actually on the ground doing that sort of stuff. And then the other side of things, which is that stories can have an impact, and sometimes even if we think about it, like a lot of our stories are part of this like huge churn of digital information that's just getting tossed around. Sometimes things can actually impact other things, even if they're small and local, but sometimes they're like global and worldwide. And so that kind of stuff just goes to prove that, stories can sway things in people and make shit change.
Yeah. It could also just be like, being somebody that consistently pushes a company or individual or government can, even if the story doesn't necessarily change things, you could also, even through your just like persistence, have them change their messaging, right? If you're just always reaching out about something, there's I think you're right. Like 99% of the stories we write have no impact. Like it's just like people like
Talk
use
about
it as
being doomsday.
yeah. Well, I mean, it's like just like rage bait or like
Yeah.
yeah, or it's like 15 companies covering the same piece of news, right? So it's like, well, like, do we really need all 15? Probably not. But like, you know, there are stories that like inform people, give them perspectives they hadn't heard before, change debates. I mean, like change kind of conversations. Like CoinDesk has been doing some great reporting over the past 2 days about Trump's crypto project, and they've completely changed like how the crypto industry has been talking about it. So and maybe it forces Trump's team to, I don't know, not use these people that made like a hacked DeFi protocol. Like, yeah, that's an example of like a story that's making waves that actually is potentially impacting conversations both publicly and privately. So
we're nearing the end of the conversation, and I want to touch on a story that you recently published in The Verge about OpenSea and NFTs. Do you want to give us the lay of the land of how that went? Because you had that from before you started at DL News. And if you want to just tell us a little bit about how long that took, why you got interested in it, how like the whole writing process went, and a little bit more like, on the ground feeling of what it went like from like ideation to actual publishing.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, of the pieces I've written, wasn't the most labor intensive. I reached out to hundreds of sources for that. There were 18 current and former employees I spoke to for that story. And I think probably maybe 30 to 40 sources I spoke to in total. Many of them just didn't make it into the article. There are a lot of sections that were cut. And there was an independent fact checker that checked the piece. Then it went through a number of different legal reviews. So I think, it was a pretty intensive experience, but just trying to think of what else to say about it. It took a long time.
Did you have fun writing it though?
That's the thing, and maybe this is the thing about like when I was talking about like the aesthetic type of thing. It's like when you go long, like you can write funny stuff, and you can like do like funny, like I don't know. Like, the ending scene of that is me on this DGen yacht club party during NFT NYC, and I just like had so many silly interactions and fun interactions with people. Like there was this guy who said cyber frogs changed his life. Someone else had like this stuffed animal named Chonky. There was a reunion between a man named Breads and another man named Toast. Like, it was just so
brilliant.
It was just so silly. And I think when you write long, you can breathe life into stories that just aren't possible when you do like a 400, 500 word kind of like spot news write up. So those were the parts that I really enjoyed, and I think it was like there is something also quite intellectually rigorous about like especially when you're doing a bigger piece like that, that's attracting attention from the company, and when there's everyone's kind of checking their legal pages and making sure that they're okay. Like it's quite a rigorous conversation about like, do we know this? Do we not know this? What can we say? What can we not say? And I think that's a good exercise to do to kind of bring to when then you're doing quicker write-ups of stories that you have to get out in an hour or two. So
brilliant. And I'd suggest everybody who's listening in later because go and read it. It's great. And it's funny because I'm writing up a longer piece right now about the pop-up city that I've been covering and I've been visiting, and I was just also thinking about it this morning. It's not entirely there, but I was also thinking about like, how can I breathe a little bit more color into the characters that I've met and the conversations that I've had, and like keep it a little bit more like in-person experience rather than just like straight reporting and telling the things like that. And so I was also tossing up some that additional, I don't know what you want to call it, I usually call it color, but into the story itself.
I mean, color is great. It's a way of kind of making readers actually be there.
So look, Ben, this has been brilliant. I always end these conversations with the same two questions. We've sort of tiptoed around this idea a few times of like reading, and I'm always interested in what fellow colleagues, journalists are reading. So one is, what are you reading at the moment, like book-wise?
Mm-hmm.
And then is there a specific book that you always recommend, or that you've found yourself recommending a lot lately? It can be crypto related. It doesn't have to be. You can just take it in whatever direction you want.
So currently I'm reading The Network State by Balaji.
Are you going to go and visit it?
Yes, that's why I'm reading it. So I'm going to the Network State conference in Singapore. So, and I'm planning on writing about it. So, it's good to kind of like understand what he believes and what he's saying. So that's a harder read. That's just kind of like very
as expected,
pie in the sky theoretical. In terms of journalism book, I mean, I think this is like pretty well known, but I really do think it's actually like a very good kind of like theoretical conversation you could have for with another journalist. But Janet Malcolm's Journalist and the Murderer. Basically, Janet Malcolm, a long time like New Yorker writer, and she wrote up this piece about this journalist and his like slightly manipulative ways that he convinced a murderer to let basically the way he got access to a murderer, and like how he kind of manipulated that person to give him access. And she kind of has this point that like all journalists are liars and manipulators. Which I think is like, is a bit provocative, but it also gets to the point of like, what are how do we get people to talk to us? Right. And that when it's, at least in the US, you don't pay people to talk to you. So like, how do you get them? and then I think that that brings up the questions of like manipulation, or like or what are the incentives for sources to talk with journalists, and it's just like a very interesting kind of read that makes you kind of reflect on one's craft in that way. So
no, that's a brilliant suggestion. I actually think that I've gotten a lot of really good suggestions, but I think that one might have made it to the top of the Amazon list for one that I'm gonna order. Yeah, it sounds really interesting.
Well, if you're ever in New York City, I have a copy, so I can lend it to you.
Nice, definitely will. I'll hit you up. But yeah, Ben, thanks heaps for this. This has been a brilliant conversation. You gave me quite a few things to think about, and anything else that you want to say to leave our listeners of this conversation on?
No. Goodbye.
Awesome. Have a good one, man. Take care.
Cool. Thanks.